The cold air inside the abandoned hangar smelled of rust, smoke and sweat. Faded sunlight filtered through broken windows, drawing long lines of gold across the cracked concrete floor. In the middle of the room sat a young woman, Alina, a volunteer who had been captured the night before while helping civilians escape from the outskirts of the city. Her wrists were tied tightly behind her back, the rough rope cutting into her skin. Every small movement made her wince, but she refused to let a sound escape her lips. Around her stood several soldiers, men with hollow eyes and stained uniforms. They laughed, harsh, ugly laughter that echoed through the empty hall. To them she was just another prisoner, another symbol of the other side. The oldest among them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned over her. "Still trying to look brave?" he sneered. "You think someone will come for you?" Alina didn't answer. She stared straight ahead, her mind racing but her face calm. She remembered her parents, both doctors, both working near the front lines to save lives. They had taught her to never show fear, even when surrounded by it. The soldiers tied her to a metal chair in the center of the hangar, their laughter growing louder. One of them mocked her, calling her the little heroine. Another poured a cup of water and splashed it across her face, just to see if she'd break. But she didn't. She simply blinked the water away, her jaw clenched, her gaze steady. "Look at her," said the youngest soldier, his grin faltering for a moment. "She's not even scared." "Everyone breaks," replied the one with the scar. "Give her time." For a brief second, silence fell, heavy and strange. The laughter stopped. The only sound was the wind whistling through a shattered window and the faint creak of the chair as Alina shifted. Somewhere outside, an engine roared in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder. The soldiers didn't notice it right away. They were too busy pretending to be powerful. But Alina heard it. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that sound, the familiar rumble of a military convoy, one she had heard many times before when her parents arrived at field hospitals. Something inside her whispered, "They're coming!" The distant hum of engines grew louder, turning into a deep rhythmic thunder that shook the thin metal walls of the hangar. Dust fell from the rafters, swirling in the cold air. The soldiers froze mid-laughter, exchanging uncertain glances. "What the hell is that?" muttered the youngest one, stepping toward the door. The scarred commander barked, "Stay put, probably one of ours." But even he didn't sound sure. The noise was different, disciplined, powerful, too precise to belong to their ragged unit. Alina lifted her head, her eyes flickering with hope she tried desperately to hide. The rope still bit into her wrists, but her pulse quickened. She strained her ears, catching the distinct sound of armored vehicles coming to a stop just beyond the gates. Then silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The hangar doors groaned as a pair of headlights flashed through the cracks. The soldiers raised their weapons, tense now, unsure whether to fight or hide. A voice outside shouted something, firm, commanding, unmistakably confident. The scarred man stiffened, recognition flickering in his eyes. "That can't be," he whispered. A moment later, the doors burst open. Cold air swept in, carrying the smell of diesel and rain. A line of figures entered, soldiers in clean, modern gear, moving with synchronized precision. And at their front were two people the captured girl instantly recognized, her parents. Her mother, dressed in a dark military medic's coat, stepped forward first, her expression like carved stone. Behind her was her father, a quiet, stern man with a sidearm holstered at his waist and eyes that missed nothing. Both carried the quiet authority of people who had seen too much war and refused to bow to it. The scarred commander's weapon trembled in his hands. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Her father didn't answer. He simply looked around the hangar, his eyes falling on Alina tied to the chair. For a heartbeat, every sound vanished. No wind, no breath, just the sight of a father seeing his daughter bound and bruised. Then, in a low, steady voice that cut through the silence, he said, "Untie her, now." No one moved, but everyone felt it. The power in his words, the storm that had just arrived. For a long moment, the hangar was still, the kind of silence that crackles with danger. Alina's father stood motionless at the doorway, his presence filling the room like a shadow stretching over them all. The soldiers who had been laughing minutes ago now stood frozen, uncertain, their hands shaking around their rifles. The commander with the scar finally found his voice. "She's our prisoner," he barked, trying to sound in control. "You have no authority here." Alina's mother took a slow step forward, her eyes locked on her daughter. Every heartbeat felt like thunder. "You tied my daughter to a chair," she said quietly, her voice cold as steel. "And you think you still have authority?" One of the soldiers shifted nervously, lowering his gun. The rest followed, instinctively recognizing that these newcomers were not to be tested. The insignia on the father's uniform gleamed faintly. In the dim light, Colonel of the Strategic Response Division. The scarred commander's face paled. He had heard of that unit. Everyone had. Alina's father moved closer, every step measured and deliberate. "Who gave you the order to detain her?" he asked. No one answered. "Was it your idea to humiliate a civilian volunteer, to laugh while you bound her?" His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of quiet authority was heavier than any shout. The scarred man's lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. Behind him, the younger soldier who had earlier mocked Alina dropped his weapon entirely. "Sir, we didn't know who she was," he stammered. "That's the point," the colonel replied, turning his gaze toward him. "You shouldn't have needed to." He walked to Alina and knelt beside her. His hands, steady but gentle, worked at the knots cutting into her wrists. The moment the ropes fell, Alina threw her arms around him, shaking with quiet relief. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder, eyes glistening but firm. The colonel stood and looked back at the men who had tormented her. "You're lucky," he said evenly. "If she hadn't survived this, you wouldn't either." Then he turned to his wife. "Secure them, and make sure they remember what respect looks like." The laughter that once filled the hangar was gone, replaced by the heavy echo of boots, orders, and the shame of men who had finally realized what they'd done. The hangar was unrecognizable now, the chaos replaced by a tense, disciplined order. The soldiers who had once mocked and laughed now stood in a trembling line along the wall, their weapons confiscated, their eyes lowered. The sound of boots echoed as Alina's parents moved through the space, issuing quiet commands to their unit. Outside, the rain had started. Droplets tapped against the metal roof, a steady rhythm that filled the uneasy silence. Alina sat on a wooden crate near the center of the hangar, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her wrists were still raw from the ropes, but she didn't complain. Her father crouched beside her, examining the marks with quiet care. "You held on," he said softly. She gave a weak smile. "You taught me not to break." Her mother approached and placed a steaming cup of tea in her hands. "Drink," she said gently. "You're safe now." For the first time since her capture, Alina let herself breathe. The warmth from the tea spread through her fingers, and tears she had refused to shed finally welled in her eyes. She looked at her parents, not just as rescuers, but as people who had seen the worst of humanity and still chosen compassion over cruelty. Across the hangar, the scarred commander shifted uncomfortably under the colonel's gaze. "Sir," he said finally, his voice hoarse, "we didn't mean—" The colonel raised a hand, stopping him. "You don't get to speak meaning into your actions," he said quietly. "You tied a helpless girl to a chair and called it war. That's not duty, that's cowardice." No one argued. The words hung heavy in the air, like a verdict already delivered. A moment later, a young medic entered and saluted. "The transport is ready, sir. The storm is closing in." The colonel nodded and turned to his daughter. "We're going home." Alina stood slowly, her legs trembling but steady. As they walked toward the open doors, she glanced back one last time. The soldiers who had once laughed now stood drenched in silence, their arrogance stripped away. The rain poured harder outside, washing the blood and dust from the ground. As Alina stepped into it, she lifted her face to the sky, free, alive, and stronger than the fear that once surrounded her. The storm was over, but its lesson would remain forever.